Now, today we are going to talk about something that I learned about some time back. I was listening to a podcast episode, and this guy was talking about, I think, intelligence agencies in the USA. And he was talking about how they had been working on trying to get their soldiers to sharpen a sixth sense. I think this is what it was some time back. So I'm not 100% sure that those were the exact facts. But what I do know is what I got from the podcast, which is our topic of today. If I remember clearly, this guy was talking about how soldiers in the field need to develop a sixth sense so that they're better useful to themselves and they're better able to do their jobs. So, an example would be something like if a soldier is driving through a certain neighborhood, and let's say it's in Iraq, let's go back to the war in Iraq. If they're driving through a certain area or certain neighborhood and they get a sense that something is off, they is this kind of information that they are tapping into reliable? How can we The idea was, how could the intelligence agencies train their soldiers so that their soldiers could perfect that sixth sense, so that they were better able to identify when there was trouble and when they were safe. The thing that they were calling the sixth sense was something they call sense making, right? Like making sense making. And so that fascinated me. And so I went to try and do my homework and try and figure out what this was about. And so I found some stuff that didn't really explain it the way I had it on the podcast. I wish I could remember what podcast it was and what the guy was, who it was that was talking, so that I could share the link. But unfortunately, I can't remember. Now, sense making. That's what we're going to be talking about today. What I found comes pretty close to what I had about, but it's more like the watered down version of what I had. It's more like how do we say this? It's like the more polished definitions of what I had, right? And of what I found on the internet. And it makes sense, right? They wouldn't want to publish information that made somebody think that they were absolutely crazy. There might be a bit of jargon in it, but I think you might be able to understand what sense making is about and how even you could perhaps tap into it and maybe try and sharpen that sixth sense for yourself. So let's jump into it. So the first thing we're going to go over was something that I found by a man called Richard J. Cords. Now, Richard, the way he defines it is that. So this is what I'm just going to read directly from what he says, right, from his website. Now, this is what he says. This is what Richard says. If this is the first time you have seen the phrase sense making, embrace this moment of uncertainty with rigor and intention. While we should endeavor to never define a word by using the word in its own definition, we find a rare exception in sense making. For in our attempt to define the phrase is an opportunity for the phrase to define itself. Sense making is what you are doing at this moment as you concurrently interpret dozens of symbols by shifting spatial attention at a rate of up to 5 times per second in order to parse, that's PARSE, and integrate the information coded in those grouped symbols using your brain's complex adaptive networks of over 100 trillion synapses. If that last sentence was hard to parse than the one prior, it is because the first was designed with the rhythm, meter, and antimetabole. In other words, it is built with structure and pattern that builds expectations and reduces complexity, making it far easier for the brain to interpret and make sense of. The second of the two sentences stresses our sense making, as it does not compartmentalize ideas or scope well. Instead, building an endless scaffold with just enough objects and descriptions to move beyond the capacity of our short term memory. Our brains are active inference systems like no other. But just as fish is blind to water until it is stressed by exposure to the surface, we are often blind to our own incredible, expansive, inspiring ability to make sense of our environment until we no longer can. Just to kind of summarize that, it's like sense make. I'm sure some of you have had this thing where you say it's intuition and you're able to extract information about what's going on around you in such a way that it's almost like you're not even aware of what you're doing, but you come to the bottom of something, and you come to the bottom of your sense making, and you come to a decision that about whatever is happening around you. So maybe you come to the decision that this place is not safe, right? And sometimes you're right and sometimes you're wrong. And so basically, when you're right, you're like, wow, I'm able to do that. But when you're wrong, then it's a little daunting. So it's like, what is this thing that I'm trying to do? And so this is the thing that we're talking about when we talk about the military, and they're trying to sharpen this sixth sense. Now, sense making is our brain's response to novel or potentially unexpected stimuli as it integrates new information in an ever updating model of the world. If we look under the hood of most machine learning technology, there are networks performing what is called iterative gradient descent, which is an attempt to take predicted outputs, which are expectations, and compare them with actual outputs, which is reality, and then use the deviation between the two and select and adjust the segments of the model that most impact the deviation between expectation and reality. Let me just kind of break that down. What they're trying to look at how sense making works, and so they look at machines and they see how machines do it. And what these machines call iterative gradient descent is a process by which it attempts to take predicted outputs, right? So it takes what it's expecting is going to happen, and it compares it with with actual outputs, what it actually put out, which is the reality, right? And so it sees does the reality of what it has done versus what it expected to do actually match up. And if it doesn't, it goes back and it sees what are the things that stopped the reality to match up with expectations, and it makes changes based on that. Now, this adjustment intends to increase the clarity of the model's perception of an event in the interest of reducing surprise when encountering similar events in the future. So it's learning, right? It's learning. When this simple process is iterated across large networks with many millions of connections, it can enable computers to reliably detect complicated patterns, like we talked about, like the soldiers out in the desert. There is information coming in through their senses, the sight, the hearing, your internal organs. What is your heart rate doing? What is your heart doing? And you take all these things and you try and look for patterns in all of this, right? And so so I guess this is what they're talking about when they say it enables computers to reliably detect complicated patterns. The computers are trying to do the same, and so human beings are seeing how they perform sense making by watching computers. Now, underneath the mystified technologies associated with self-driving cars, chessbots, and automated social media trolls, is the application of this very simple abstract process of gauging and adjusting expectations against contacts with reality. At scale, over a variety of networks. Sorry, that's one sentence. Underneath the mystified technologies associated with self driving cars, chessbots, and automated social media trolls is the application of this very simple abstract process of gauging and adjusting expectations against contacts with reality at scale over a variety of network patterns. The brain does something similar in fine tuning the connections among its neurons, except the infrastructure and network patterns are guided by billions of years of evolution. So that's the difference between us and the machines. Our brains have evolved over billions of years, right? Now, our brain is performing this gauging of expectations against reality at all times and at a variety of levels, asking simultaneously, what word am I looking at? What does this sentence mean for my understanding of the world? Right? Those are the questions it asks itself. At just the physical level, visual data comes in at a rate and in dimensions that transcend our ability to measure using traditional methods like frames per second, and is accompanied by a notable spatial readjustment at around 4 or 5 times per second. And this says nothing about audio, which is echo, smell and taste, which is olfactory, or touch, tactile, streams. So this is what we just said. The human being is processing all these things so fast that it's below our level of awareness, right? Like we are talking about looking at visual images, right? Like a movie, you're processing a movie while processing audio information, while processing smell and taste, while also processing whatever information comes in through the skin. And so you're processing all this information and making sense of it. And if you can process that information well enough and put out useful information, it can be like a sixth sense, right? Sense making. Now, the word levels likely does no justice to what it intends to represent, as our body is not a hierarchy but an interconnected, complex, distributed system of systems making sense of multiple non-linear information streams simultaneously, which is unlike machines, which today or in the past have generally been hierarchical linear processing devices or entities. Now, the amygdala is processing physical and hormonal data to interpret threats, and areas of the prefrontal cortex are moderating that sense data based on feedback from multiple memory streams. The kidneys, the pancreas, the hypothalamus, the liver, and the spine are all receiving and providing sense data to facilitate rapid, continuous sense making in response to millions of little surprises the body experiences and creates on a daily basis. Sense making is literally the act of making sense of an environment, achieved by organizing sense data until the environment becomes sensible or is understood well enough to enable reasonable decisions. Now, organized, sensible, understood, and reasonable. This is the language that characterizes the information environment after the information environment after good sense making has occurred. Right? That's when there's good sense making, it's organized, sensible, understood, and reasonable. This definition can apply to all kinds of systems that attempt to model the environment as network patterns. Patterns which adapt based on the deviations between sense data and expectation. However, it is important to note that these adjustments and adaptations are made on the models for expectations, not on the environment itself. We process this data and we come to a conclusion, and then we see whether our conclusion matches the reality of what's actually happening. And we make little adjustments based on whether whether the reality of what our decision is meets the expectations of what is actually happening around us. I hope I haven't lost you. Now, what is the difference between sense making and meaning making? Sense making is the ability or attempt to make sense of an ambiguous situation. More exactly, sense making is the process of creating situational awareness and understanding in situations of high complexity or uncertainty in order to make decisions. It is a motivated, continuous effort to understand connections which can be among people, places, and events in order to anticipate their trajectories and act effectively. The sixth sense, to see things before they happen and to be spot on about what it is that you are predicting. Now, meaning making and sense making are often used synonymously, but they are different. Meaning making is the process by which we interpret situations or events in the light of our previous knowledge and experience. It is a matter of identity. It is who we understand ourselves to be in relation to the world around us. In other words, sense making is about making sense of the external world, while meaning making is about relating it to our inner world, asking the question, what does this situation mean to me? That's the difference between sense making and meaning making. Sense making is, to the extent it ever can be, objective, while meaning making is subjective. In reality, it is hard to separate the two, but there is value in making the distinction as best as we can. Now, like I said, I came to this topic of sense making because I had somebody talking about a sixth sense, right? And for me to have information about something new, to find out something new about myself, it's as if it's like somebody tells you that you're Spider-Man, right? You wake up one day and somebody tells me, by the way, you have the same abilities as Spider-Man. And so you're like, what? That's incredible. I need to figure out how that is possible. And I need to tap into that. And so that was my fascination with sense making as a sixth sense. And I'm sure many of you have experienced situations where it's almost like you have a premonition about what is coming, or these moments in life when you want something and you kind of attract it. It's like you attract it into your life. It's almost like magic, right? I'm not saying those two are the same things, but it's along those lines of being able to put into words and to make tangible these mysterious things that we experience in our life. And I think sense making really is one of those things. Now, I found another article, I think it's by an intelligence agency, I'm not sure, but more on sense making. Now, this article says this: shapeless mysteries plus complexities, or wicked problems, or simply messes. They come without history or shape. Large numbers of relatively small actors respond to a shifting set of situational factors. Thus, they do not necessarily repeat in any established pattern and are not amendable to predictive analysis in the same way as mysteries. So, you know how you can analyze certain data and you're like, you learn how to like statistics. If you When you learn how to do statistics, there's nothing unpredictable that can stop you from coming to a correct answer, right? It's like once you know how to do the math, you the only way you don't come to a correct answer is if you make a mistake. Sense making doesn't give you that luxury of feeling like this is how you do this and this, right? Sense making is a complex activity. I guess that's what we're trying to say here, what this next article says. Now, for complexities, especially, the challenge is to employ sense making, right? The term is from Michigan psychologist Carl Wick. Exactly how to accomplish sense making is a tall task that still mostly lies before us, which makes this article such an important contribution. Sense making departs as Moore notes. Moore is a person, Moore notes, from the post war tradition of Sherman Kent, in which analysis meant, in the directory's language, the process of separating something into its constituent elements. That is analysis. Now, David Moore's approach to sense making takes us from information forging, harvesting, and marshalling, marshalling into understanding. Now, what is mindlessness? We are surrounded by errors and they are ours. Intelligence officials at the national level repeatedly use the same excuses for professional errors and for the systematic failure that follow. Despite directives to fix the structures, most recently the means by which intelligence is created, we insistently fail at our obligation to make early sense of vital threats and opportunities. What is our problem? We may begin by explaining the concept of mindlessness. This is now the other part of the coin that we're talking about, where why are we not able to really grasp this sense making sixth sense? Right? And so this article introduces the idea of mindlessness. Now, Ellen Langer, summarizing her pioneering social psychology research, finds mindlessness to arise from an over reliance on categories and distinctions created in the past. It's like we said, if you learn how to do statistics, you get into a pattern of doing things a certain way, right? When you're a pilot, you might, get comfortable with doing things a certain way, and so, or rather, let's say you're a pilot, you've been flying the airs, and your training has taught you how to do things a certain way, and then let's say maybe out of the blue, maybe aliens start flying across the sky, right? That's something that is out of the norm for you, and you could end up missing the signs that this is not a very safe area to be flying, because aliens flying across the sky for you is not, maybe it's not something that you have adapted to. And I think that's what we mean this is what they mean when they're talking about an over reliance on categories and distinctions created in the past. Now, Ellen Langer, she holds that such categories take on a life of their own. Seen in this context, the failure to recognize in foresight so this is an example. Seen in this context, the failure to recognize in foresight that an American or a Nigerian man could be a member of Al Qaeda arises from a rigid deductive categorization of who is a member of Al Qaeda and is a case of mindlessness. So let's say an American is joins the Al Qaeda, right? And you have an American in America and they walk into a building. Mindlessness is going to tell the security guard that that cannot possibly be a threat because he's white American. Whereas sense making, if you are sense making, maybe you would have seen him in a, I don't want to sound racist, but maybe you would have seen him in an outfit that doesn't match with his ethnicity. You know, I don't want to sound racist in this because I'm sure there are Americans who wear, the Muslim attire, but with sense making, at least you would notice that and you'd be like, that's off, right? And maybe you might pay more attention to that. Whereas if you are mindless, you just think the only threat that could possibly be Al Qaeda is an Arabic looking man, right? Now, Langer also sees mindlessness arising from automatic behavior. Here, people rely on automatic responses as the basis for their behavior, as when one writes a check in January with the previous year's dates, right? So when you're so used to writing checks in January, you're still writing the date for the previous year, and so you make a mistake because of automatic behavior. By extension, intelligence professionals in assessing sources may develop a habit of discounting human intelligence sources because some are untrustworthy. As a result, they may miss novel insights because they use certain sources to the exclusion of others. Finally, mindlessness can result from a failure to take into account alternative information that transcends our comfortable worldview. Langer observes that highly specific instructions encourage mindlessness because they define what is acceptable and limit the viability of alternative science that could lead to more accurate understandings of phenomena. Decision makers often suffer from poor attention management, being obsessed with the wrong types of signals and ignoring possibilities that could significantly improve the fate of their undertaking. They characterize these behaviors as fixations and relaxation. People who fixate become so preoccupied with a few central signs that they largely ignore things at their periphery. A deadly example of fixation occurred in 1977 when a KLM 747 flight crew on Tenerife failed to avoid a collision with a Pan Am 747. They didn't give sufficient attention to the presumably very important communications coming in from air traffic controllers. Naval advisors engage in night landings on aircraft carriers also fixate, and this leads to pilots ignoring the obvious and doing the inexplicable, and often dying. Such fixations are goal-oriented, taking off in the former example and landing in the second. The pilots know intellectually what to do, but their fixation on an emotional goal misfocuses them. Knowing is no match for emotion. While they are fixated, they are not truly aware, nor are they living in the moment. Instead, they're inadvisably envisioning themselves already in the air or on the deck and expecting the resulting emotional sense of relief. Now, Boquet and Bryant identify relaxation as when, after sustained periods of high concentration, people become unfocused on the task at hand and look at the ultimate goal. So that is what causes mindlessness, right? Fixation and relaxation. Fixation is paying too much attention to one thing rather than giving yourself the room to take in novel information, new things that you might need to consider for this situation, right? So if let's say you're a pilot and you land every day, every day, every day, you get into a habit and behave and routine, and so you you become fixated on the fact that you have landed, on the feeling of landing and feeling safe once you've landed, and you relax, and so you're not giving yourself the room to expect the unexpected, right? And that's how people end up making really, really bad mistakes that they could have avoided. Sense making is about anticipating uncertainty as opposed to reacting to it. This means that the processes of sense making, and particularly collaborative sense making, are never satisfied with the status quo. Rather, sense making institutions constantly admit and raise doubts about what they believe, because threats, as typified by many 21st century issues, can emerge at any time, anywhere, and in a variety of forms. Analysts need to think more in terms of a broad mental readiness to perceive early warning signs. So that's basically what I found about sense making, and I thought it was very interesting. I thought I thought I would share it with you guys and kind of raise your consciousness when it comes to this idea of the sixth sense. So hopefully you've understood what I was trying to say, or what all the literature that I have presented says, and maybe you can start trying to sharpen your own sixth sense. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope to see you guys on the next one. Take care.